That's
Today, about gardening for a changing climate, gardening for a changing weather. I know we all, maybe don't think that today or last week or next week that our weather is changing, but it certainly is. So, it's going to tell us how to use with that. But before she does, I want to tell you that we have some programs coming up. This one will be repeated at the library in Hillsborough on Sunday of this week from 2 to 3:30. And then Pascal Mittendorf will be doing meadow gardening at the library in Hillsborough on Sunday, February 16th from 2 to 3:30. And Pascal has the most amazing meadow garden. If you are interested in meadow gardening, do not miss the library presentation on Sunday, February 16th. Then here on Thursday, February 20th, we have from 10 to 11:30, Linda Bell, who is a landscape designer, is going to be talking about native perennials, ones that grow really well in our area. So I think that should be a great one. Then and this is fun, on the 16th and 17th of March, the 16th at the library, the 17th here, which is a Monday from 2 to 3:30, is going to be edible flowers. And Faye McNaught is going to talk about that. And from experience, I know that Faye bakes and cooks with edible flowers. So she's a great one for that. I will always tell you that mark your calendars. Our big Bridge Fest, our Plantsville Educational Festival is October 11th,
20
Saturday.
here, and then how many?
Farm.
Fit to plus me.
Two plus
On your calendar.
Lisa or
Oh, hard to hear when we're talking.
in the background?
I don't even know what.
There's something.
It's not picking up this way, is it?
It should. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, it might be. Rest.
Pleased to share some of the information I got in my research about climate change gardening. And I will tell you, we're going to talk about a lot of things that you can do. First, we're going to give some background and talk about what are the different ways the climate is changing. All the things that I have suggested in my PowerPoint are on a handout as you go out, so you do not need to take notes on that. You'll get that information.
So will we get that information?
So one of the things that has helped create
I get it.
our climate situation is the fact that we have been eager to try to control Mother Nature rather than working with her. And Mother Nature has a way of providing her own balance over time. Not necessarily, doesn't mean you won't have years where you get tons of Japanese beetles, but over time, she strives for a balance. And so one of the things I think that we need to really keep in mind is being patient and observing what's happening in Mother Nature and caring for the environment. I don't know that anybody purposely tries to ignore the food and soil webs that are the base of everything that grows, but it happens anyway. I'm sure many of you have seen some version of this before, how plants, flowers, nuts, seeds, fruit feed certain animals who then get predated by other animals and so on. So one of the things that's true that we have to be aware of is that if any one of those levels disappears, it all is affected. So the little things matter. And even more importantly, there's a soil food web. And As it says, there are millions of organisms in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil. And we're going to talk a lot about soil because if there's one thing you can do to adapt to climate change, it's taking good care of the soil. So, so there are many different kinds of, I'll call them soil critters that are in the soil. And they really are the ones that help plants grow. Another interesting thing I think is this picture. You can see the tree above ground, and then you see all the root system below ground. We always focus or tend to focus on the top part of what's on the ground, but 80% of a plant's energy goes into the root system underneath the ground. So that's another strong reason for taking care of the soil. This mycorrhizae and fungi, well, mycorrhizae is a fungi, are the powerhouses of soil. They are the ones that really they have a symbiotic relationship with plants. They take the carbon and the sugars from the plant, and they they're digested in their way, and that provides decomposed organic matter, nutrients, water, and the things that plants need. So they're really, really critical. I know sometimes when people are gardening, they dig and they see all this white stringy stuff and they think, oh my gosh, what's wrong? That's the fungi doing their job. They're decomposing the organic matter. Okay, so let's start talking about all the different ways that the climate is impacted, or by how our growing is impacted as the climate changes. Schedules are changed. So plants, I think probably many of you have already noticed this, that plants may be flowering sooner, fruiting sooner. And that doesn't sound like such a bad thing, except for there's a food web. And bees need nectar at certain times to raise their young, and birds need caterpillars at certain times to raise their young. So if those things are merging, then we've got birds that can't raise their young. They don't have any food. So that's one critical thing. Also, with changing climate, it seems like those things that are those exotic plants that are so adaptable are the ones that really are getting profusely growing and tending to take over. I mean, who doesn't have Japanese stilt grass? The picture there is of a bog plant called Phragmites, a grass. And in Michigan, where we came from, we saw a bit of it when we moved in the few years that we lived there. It had taken over everything. And the problem with that is that it doesn't provide any food for anybody, and it outgrows other things. I think we all know about that. This is timely because we know that the severity and frequency of weather conditions are increasing. The floods, the hurricanes, the drought, the wildfires, all of that is coming faster. They've always been there, but it's coming faster and more frequently. And that kills, weakens, and stresses plants, those changing conditions. And so when a plant is stressed, if it survives, when it's stressed, it's much more vulnerable to pests eating it. It's weaker. If it's a fruit or vegetable, it doesn't produce as well. And what it does produce is missing some of its nutritional value. So that affects us all. Also, hurricanes, flooding, and fires can deposit contaminants that are long lasting in the soil. I think about the fires in California going on now and all the flame retardants that are being used. And the one that they use, the pink cloud, I think it's called, that they use most commonly is actually a fertilizer based fire retardant. And we know that we're going to be talking a little bit more about this in the future, but excess fertilizer actually kills the soil, kills all those little soil critters. It's not good for plants. And we all probably have recognized the heat island effect, particularly in urban areas where all the buildings and the pavement makes, and of course, the lack of vegetation tends to raise the temperature and again, provides more stress for plants. And the more that vegetation is eliminating, the more this gets exacerbated. And plants, this is probably something everybody knows, but plants in the process of photosynthesis, actually, they take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it for making their food. And so it's taking it out of the atmosphere, it's lowering the carbon availability in the atmosphere. So the fewer plants you have, the more carbon you're going to have in the atmosphere, which is what we're trying to avoid now that we know that. And also, one of the things locally we find is that various times of the year tend to be wetter than they used to be. And so that has a tendency to create more not good fungus diseases. Another way climate change matters is we don't have to deal with this so much here that I'm aware of, but like a good example is in the Arctic climates where the Eskimos and the other native peoples have lived have used polar bears and seals and things like that, that love that weather for food, clothing, housing, whatever. And that lifestyle is going away. Our polar bears are going away. And so that has a big impact. This was really an interesting thing I hadn't ever thought about, and that is that things like maple syrup. I love maple syrup, but the maple syrup, the sap runs in those particular sugar maples are decreasing. So I don't know what's going to happen with the maple syrup supply. Maybe they'll find some magic way to do it. Maybe it'll move to Canada. We'll have to pay tariffs on it or something. But anyway, so prices may rise or they may just not be available. And as the heat rises, of course, the soil is going to be drier and warmer, and that means more watering or stressed plants or there are a couple good possibilities coming with climate change. And one is, I mean, this isn't really a good thing, but it may be a positive side effect. As plants die, they release more nitrogen into the air, and then the plants can take that up. The plants that are surviving can take that nitrogen in and use it to create more biomass. So that's a good thing. The other thing is, it's very possible since, well, we're going to talk in a minute about plants migrating and moving. So some plants from South Carolina or Georgia or other locations could be moving here to contribute to a greater diversity. Other effective climate change is that with longer, warmer times, that you have more breeding time for predatory insects to have more generations of babies. when it gets cold in the winter long enough, there are some diseases, not diseases, some pests, particularly ground pests that actually can't survive the cold. And we, as being farmers with goats, we know that, the goats can get parasites, and the parasites come out when they poop and go, the parasites lay eggs in the ground, and they are turned into, in the ground, they become larvae. Then the goats, when the larvae come up to the soil level, the goats eat hay and other things and take that larva in, and the parasites grow in their bodies. So when it's not real cold for a long enough time, we have a lot more parasites. And that creates other problems. When we have drought, some of you may have experienced this in the last year or two. I certainly have. The soil kind of forms a crust and becomes hydrophobic. So even when you water it, the water doesn't want to go in. And since I sell plants at the farmer's market, I have a lot of plants in pots. And pots do the same thing. You could water them and it just runs out. So I'll go ahead and talk about one of the things that helps with that now. It's probably somewhere further in the presentation, but if you take 1 gallon of water and put in 4 teaspoons of a mild dish detergent, that tends to, the surfactant in the dish detergent tends to break down that soil crust. And then you water it deeply after that, so the plants can get the moisture to the roots. Plants, we all know plants do photosynthesis in the daylight hours, where they take the carbon dioxide and the oxygen from the atmosphere and use it to make their food, and also feed the little mycorrhizae in the ground. And then at night they transpire, which means that actually plants take in way more moisture than they need, somewhere between 97 and 99.5% moisture they will give back because they don't need it. And they give it back through these pores on the underside of leaves called stomata. And when the weather gets too hot, those systems shut down. And some plants they don't necessarily die, but they'll go dormant. They look like they're dead. Their root systems may still be in place, so there's a chance they could come back. But that whole process just really weakens and stresses plants. I wanted to throw in a couple of ways that climate change affects people. There's a lot of different ways, obviously, but hay fever, ticks, and mosquitoes have longer seasons to bug us. And it costs more to cool homes in the heat, so yeah, more fuel for the climate changing. Okay, let's talk about the soil, since that's such a critical part of healthy plants. What are the things that hurt healthy soil? Over fertilizing, any kind of other contaminants and toxins that are deposited when it floods, or when it falls out of the air. Compaction, which means when particularly when it's too wet, or when it's gets a lot of heavy traffic, it gets so tight. We all know about clay, and clay is very easily compact. I mean, it kind of comes compact. But that affects the ability of the roots to get oxygen underneath the ground. It just, and doesn't let the roots go down as well. So that, again, makes it harder for plants to grow. And all those above things, and then drought and flooding have a tendency to rearrange soil, wash it away, bring in toxins, all kinds of things, dry it out. And all that affects the soil critters, which feed the plants. Okay, so now let's start talking about what you can do about all these things. Number one, because soil is the most important thing, the number one thing, if you take nothing else from this, and then you don't already know, you may already know this, but compost and mulch as soil amendments, nothing beats them. They decompose into the soil and feed the fungi and help the plant roots, help retain moisture. They actually act as kind of an insulation too when it's hot and when it's cold, because when it's hot, the soil, we talked about the soil temperature going up, but mulching mitigates some of that, so it doesn't go up so much. And same thing with the cold. It mitigates the cold getting as much down into the soil. Another thing you can do is choose plants very carefully. One of the things I think we all know about natives, there's been a lot of talk about natives in the last few years. Not only from growing natives from seed, I've noticed that they develop bigger root systems faster. And so that's one of the reasons why, and they tend to be more adaptable. And part of the reason they're so more adaptable is because they have bigger root systems. And so more food and water coming up. One of the things that I know, we have an orchard and we inherited some apple trees and things like that. But those things aren't native, and they really don't, they're high maintenance. To get a good crop, they're high maintenance. So native fruits are recommended. Things like pawpaw, blueberries, they love here. Red mulberry, stay away from white mulberry because it's invasive. Black raspberries, mayhaw, elderberry, muscadine grapes, those are all example of native fruits that are adapted to be here and tend to do much better with lower maintenance and resources. If you're doing new plantings or replacing plantings, you want to try to do not only natives, but things that are wildlife friendly, which generally natives are that. You want to choose, and not only do you want to choose them for food, that's food for wildlife is important, but also habitat. They need places to hide from predators and raise their young and overwinter and things like that. You don't want to choose invasives. And the definition of what is invasive is changing somewhat as the weather changes. It's good to choose plants that don't outgrow their space quickly, so they require pruning for maintenance. And the lower maintenance, both in terms of amendments and your time, the better. One of my favorite sayings is, if you don't choose what you're going to cover the ground with, Mother Nature will. Well, that's not really all bad, but it is helpful not to have a lot of bare ground because the weeds choose to be there instead. So using ground covers is a helpful thing to prevent as much weed penetration as possible. And it also prevents soil erosion. Okay, so we talked about the the fix for hydrophobic soils. The other thing I'd never heard before that is intriguing to me is wool fleece, just raw, when someone shears a sheep or an alpaca or something, that raw fleece can be used. In particularly, it can be used in the ground and in pots, but I think I can see the potential for being particularly useful in pots to hold moisture. To snails and slugs don't like it, so they don't tend to bother the plants as much. And it insulates, again, from hot and cold. If you think the ground heats up or cools down a lot, multiply that a few times in pots. It's a lot harder to maintain things in pots than in the ground because the plants can't choose to go deeper. They're stuck. And I am gonna try some fleece this year. And I have a recently acquired problem of squirrels digging up plants. Probably others have had that issue. I'm hoping that the fleece may help with that. I'm gonna try it and see what happens. That's part of the things that, in hoping plants adapt to this new weather, trying things. No, you won't know till you try it if it works or not. And if it does, then you've helped your plants. So, another thing that I accidentally stumbled on was trap plants. So, in my vegetable garden, I had problems with Japanese beetles, as everybody else has in various things, roses, plum trees, whatever. And because I'm not always a real neat gardener and let weeds come up, some native evening primrose popped up in my garden. And boy, do the Japanese beetles love those. They flock in droves, they breed on them. So, and I haven't had much problem with Japanese beetles eating my vegetables in the garden. So, sometimes letting Mother Nature choose something has certain benefits too. One of the things I did to check to see, I knew the Japanese beetles were clustering on the evening primrose, but I actually took some evening primrose and put it down by my plum tree that was being devastated by Japanese beetles. It helped a lot. So, finding those, looking at Mother Nature, what's happening in both tended areas and non-tended areas, and what can you learn from that to bring in to help your plants? Using genetically diverse plants. One of the things that is a pretty well-kept secret is many of the plants in like big box stores and other kinds of large plant stores. Almost all of those plants come from cuttings of roots, stems, leaves, or through what they call, but they grow them in test tubes. They take cells, grow them in test tubes, and not test tubes, petri dishes. So almost all the plants that they have are propagated that way, meaning that they are all clones, that they all have the same genetics. And that doesn't lead to good plant diversity. Adaptation, really, diversity is another key word when it comes to dealing with climate change. So watch where you buy your plants. They may be cheaper in the short term. In the long term, maybe not. Growing plants in natural communities. So when you look out in a field, you see all kinds of different kinds of plants and grasses growing together. So they all have the same light needs, moisture needs, and they actually support each other and make, it provides greater adaptability. So planting in your garden like Mother Nature does is a good healthy thing to do. And going back to the idea that we are really encouraging habitat for a lot of different levels of the food web. One of the things that has kind of been really popular is to immediately, when things die, go back and cut them down and make it look real nice and pretty and bare and not the best for wildlife. There are birds that eat the seeds that are left on those coneflowers. There are some insects that bore into stems, hollow stems, and overwinter there. So it may, in your mind, it may look neater and cleaner, but it's not the best for the environment, for the total food web. Another thing, when we look at the critters, what do they need? About 70% of all our native bees are ground dwelling, and they make tunnels in bare ground. So if everything is planted everywhere, it's good to cover most of your ground. I will attest to that. Otherwise the weeds will. But it's good to have some bare ground. And one of the ways that you can help slow down the weeds some is to kind of make a stick pile over that bare ground. So the critters can use it for shelter, for burrowing into the ground. And you don't have to worry so much about stepping on a nest that you didn't even know was there. So that's one way to do that. I'm not going to go into it in any detail, but if you have particularly wet areas, there are things you can do about that, or areas that flood pretty consistently. There's rain gardens, bioswales, French drains that can all help deal with that water to give the plants a better chance. In the vegetable garden in particularly, rather than using one of those traditional sprayers back and forth, or the ones that go out like that, using, whenever you can, drip irrigation, because it gets the water to the plants as they need it, and not watering everything, watering the weeds and everything else that's there. Using fewer fossil fuel powered tools. One of the things, since we have moved into our on our farm, I decided that when we moved in, what was to be our garden was just, it had been neglected for years. It had all sorts of scrub trees. We used the goats to kill the trees, girdle the thing over the bark. And then we went in and hand dug the whole area, so we wouldn't be using any power tools, because, well, power tools run on fossil fuels. What do fossil fuels do to the environment? Add more carbon. But there's another, maybe something you haven't thought about, a benefit from not using power tools, and that is you build those muscles and use that energy, burn those calories. I had never thought about this, but it makes perfect sense that grass is the most common invasive exotic plant in our country. And there's native plants, there's exotic plants. Not all exotic plants are bad. Exotic plants help us have some diversity. But they often just aren't as adapted to the area and don't feed as many things, but there are many that do. So one of the effective ways to help the environment is to reduce the grass. It has sharp roots. It takes a lot of water. It takes mowing. Most of the time, people save their grass clippings and probably either put them, it's good if they put them for composting, but, or it's best if you have to mow grass, leave it on the ground and let that be its compost. And I think there are places for grass. I'm not against grass, but because the roots are so shallow, because it requires so much water, because it requires fertilization, it's high maintenance. And that isn't really very helpful. About half of all residential water goes to not only just lawns and gardens, but I bet lawns take up a good percentage of that. When you're hardscaping, using permeable materials, where we live, we have rocks for our driveway. The rain can penetrate those to some degree. One of the things that I brought along a sample of a permeable paver. This can be used for driveways. It can be used for paths. If you've ever been to the North Carolina Botanical Garden, you parked on this. And the advantage of this is the water can go through. You put it on the ground or you dig it down a little bit, put soil on top. You can plant grass on it if you want to, and then you can drive on it. So when you're thinking about hardscaping, that's something to consider. I already talked about, having some areas where Mother Nature will plant for you. Hopefully not weeds. The plants, I'm sure everybody's heard of Doug Tallamy. He's a really strong environmentalist and has done a lot of research about effective things and not. And he says that if you're going to plant one plant, if you have room, it would be an oak tree because it provides the most value to the environment. Not only does it sequester the most carbon because it's so big, because it's got a strong root system, but also because it provides a lot of different kinds of habitat. And he points out that, when you have an oak tree that's however tall it is, 40 feet tall or something, the caterpillars can be eating the leaves and you don't even know it. But the birds do, and they can use those caterpillars to feed their young. So any green thing that you plant is some are more helpful than others. Grasses are not on the real helpful side, but any green thing really does help some. Of course, not using pesticides or other toxic chemicals. Probably everybody knows by now, pesticides don't just kill mosquitoes, they kill any insects, the honeybees, the native bees. So minimizing or not using those at all. And this was something I'd never thought about, annual plants. Once an annual plant it has to grow very intensively and flower and everything in one season. So it uses up a lot of resources. And it does sequester some carbon, but not as much as other things because it doesn't live as long. But when those annuals, when they're done, dead, rather than pulling it up and releasing some of that carbon into the atmosphere, cutting it off at the soil level. Little things, they're just little things, but it's those little things that helped us get where we're at now. Same thing with dead plant material, leaving the leaves. The last couple of years, we've heard a lot about that. A lot of good insects overwinter in the leaves. So plus there's such a good, you got your fertilizer right there. That's how Mother Nature does it. forest planting to encourage pollinators and other beneficial insects. This isn't really too applicable to homes, but it used to be a practice on farms that they would plant hedgerows or trees because when the winds came, they can shear off that good soil and send it somewhere else. And also the wind can be very drying for plants, so but that really doesn't apply too much to us. Using rainwater by collecting it in rain barrels and buckets or any other way you want to. It all is good. One of the things that is a helpful way in starting to plant areas that haven't been planted before. And I've done this with a couple pollinator beds that I started. Crap soil, kind of clayey and just really drained. We had some trees around there that had drained all the nutrition out of the soil. I took some cardboard. You don't want to leave tape on it. You don't want it to have any plastic things because in a year or two, you'll find it. And you want to make sure it didn't have anything toxic in it. Put that on the ground, wet it down, put compost or wood chips or combination leaves, whatever, on top of it, and let it sit for about a season. My experience was I did that in the fall, and in the spring I was planted. It is incredible the change in the quality of the soil during that time. So you don't have to use a rototiller to dig that up. Not that rototillers are always bad, not that there's a time and a place for them, but there is alternatives as well. One of the things that really has been kind of led by organic growers is the use of something called no-till or no plow. So rather than turning the soil up every year and exposing, one of the things that happens when you turn the soil up like that is that it exposes weed seeds. So you have more weeds. So you're not really accomplishing much that way. But what they have found that tilled soil is warmer, drier, and degrades the soil structure that we've talked about earlier. So one of the ways that organic growers are using, and I think we can do this in our home gardens as well, I do, is once a crop has finished, once my garlic, I harvested my garlic, then I planted, well, I use different things, but one of my favorite things is crimson clover, which is what you see up in the corner there. You plant it in the fall. It's growing now. It grows over the winter, and then it really takes a surge upward and flowers in the spring. It is gorgeous. I have seen whole fields of crimson clover. They are gorgeous. They fix nitrogen in the soil, which is what plants need. Our soil doesn't hold nitrogen very well, so nitrogen is a big deal. And then just before they start to go to seed, cut them off. You can use a scissor, you could use a power tool if you want to, but I don't recommend it. And just leave it there. Leave the biomass there. And that will decompose. If you do it 3 to 4 weeks before you plant a plant, it has decomposed enough that you could plant right into it. And you leave the roots in the ground, they'll decompose. So they self-fertilize. And by putting the cover crops in, you're preventing weeds from growing. They generally outcompete weeds. They can be very pretty, the crimson clover and the Austrian wimpy. I love their flowers. They're beautiful. And they can flower. You just don't want them to go well. They don't reseed themselves very well anyway, in my experience. But you generally don't want seeds if you want to plant what you want to plant there. That has been a real, and organic farmers are finding that they can have good yields doing those practices. So I encourage you to try them in your own vegetable garden if you have one. One of the things that, again, I can sometimes be a bit of a, not really a lazy gardener, but maybe a busy gardener. When some of my things go to seed, I don't always, so they go to seed. And right now I've got new red fire lettuce in my garden that I've covered it the last couple days, but the teen temperatures we had before I did cover it, it's still growing. So that's an example of an adapted seed. They have grown in my garden for years. They self-seed, they keep in future generations. Anything that you find that comes up on its own, cherry tomatoes are very commonly do that. I like to plant borage for the pollinators. It comes, but it self-seeds. Hill self-seeds. So there's a lot of things, but you can't cut it down or pull it up right away. You gotta let it get tall and get like looking and have those flowers on top and feed the pollinators, and you can collect seeds if you want to, or let it go and maybe they'll self-seed. So I recommend letting some of your vegetables go to seed. They do take up more room. So obviously you don't want to plant lettuce just to let it go to seed. Or mustard is another thing that I've had for several years, from the same seeds, because it's self-sown. So you don't want to plant just for seed. Well, I mean, maybe you do. It's okay if you do, but you probably don't want to plant vegetables just for seeds. But if you can leave a plant or two, it doesn't take a lot, because they each tend to produce a lot of seed. Another important thing for the environment is to provide a water source and cover for amphibians. Those toads and those frogs eat a lot of mosquitoes and other kinds of critters that we don't want to have so much around. And I actually stumbled upon this because I grow a lot of pots and plants, and in the summer it gets hot, and the natives particularly fill up their pots very quickly, and then can't really water them very well. So I bought a rigid kids swimming pool, and I soak them from the bottom, and that works very well. And having that, and then it goes with rain, and then the frogs and toads come, and then they lay eggs in it. And then I have little baby frogs and toads, and somehow they figure out how to get out of there. I'm not sure how, but so it doesn't have to be anything that big or fancy, but having some sort of water source available is helpful. See, and frogs and toads are kind of like the canary in the coal mine. They are very sensitive to toxins. So if your frogs and toads are dying off, could mean there's something that you want to get rid of around there. And how many of you have seen on your tomato plants or pepper plants those long green tomato hornworms? Okay. How many of you have seen them with a white things coming out of them? Okay. So that, maybe you already know this, but don't kill those caterpillars, because there's a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs on the surface of the caterpillar. And when the larvae come out, they eat that caterpillar from the inside out. And without those larvae, you won't have any more parasitic wasps. So leave them there. They can't do, the tomato hornworm can't do any more damage, because one year I saw one that was just had an incredible lot of white eggs on it. And I went to show my husband a few hours later and the caterpillar, I couldn't even find it. It was gone. It happens quickly. So leave those. They're good. Bug hotels are something that tend to attract a lot of beneficial insects. And as you can see, it can be very informal. Pallets are useful for making different stories, but you can use anything. You can use bamboo canes if you have to chop bamboo out of your yard. You can use clay pots, you can use broken clay pots, you can use bricks. So that provides a home and a safe place for a lot of beneficial insects. I'm gonna talk about landrace gardening, not really because I expect you to do it, because I don't see myself doing it, but because it is one of the things that is happening in some places that I think is gonna be a real shift, help shift the adaptation of plants. And that is, the landrace gardening is based on open pollinated or heirloom seeds, and you mix them like, you know, in my garden, I have a row of peas, a row of beans, a row of tomatoes. Well, they grow their seeds in what's called a grex, where they put 5 to 30 different kinds of seeds all together. It can be different kinds of tomato plants. It can be different kinds of vegetables. And then they kind of let it go and deal with whatever comes up. And with what survives, they then save the seeds and plant them. And what happens with those, with that kind of planting is that plants get a lot of opportunity to cross-pollinate and make new, diverse kinds of plants. And then when you plant those seeds, you see what qualities you want. If you want something that has a bigger plant or blooms earlier, fruits earlier, that kind of thing, then you can select for the things you want. And so that really adds to the diversity of the gene pool in plants. And then if you repeat that enough times, you get ever closer to exactly what you want, whether you, sometimes people choose for color of a plant or multiple colors of a plant. I ordered last year, I ordered some promiscuous tomato seeds, which had been grown in a grex and, you know, had lots of opportunity to cross-pollinate. And probably something in there is gonna be better adapted than not. I mean, they actually provide virtually no watering, no fertilizer, no anything, no breaking up the soil. They just plant it and let Mother Nature choose. Let's see, okay, so that takes care of that. Few things to avoid.
The question?
Oh, yeah.
In the former slide, you said open
Pollinate.
pollinated. Can you define that, please?
Yes, open pollinated are not hybrids generally. Because one of the things when you look in the Johnny's catalog, for example, if you see a tomato that says F1, that means it's a hybrid. It's the first year of being a hybrid. And when you cross-pollinate hybrids, you never know what you're gonna get. You might get something, if you want a no, that's not a good example. If you want some particular variety of tomato and it cross-pollinated, you may or may not get some. You may get some diversity, something else, which may be good, but it's not predictable. A lot of people want, if they want a particular kind of tomato, they want a particular kind of tomato. So that open pollinated are, not hybrids, but they can cross pollinate. Okay, some of the things to avoid. I think we've already talked about fertilizing, over fertilizing. Fertilizers have a lot, commercial fertilizers have a lot of salts and things that accumulate in the soil, killing those little still critters that don't like that. And it also offers the opportunity for the fertilizers to run off into our waterways and create problems there. Using synthetic weed barriers are another personal pet peeve of mine because we moved onto a property that, it had been a cornfield, so it had been totally wild. And the people that moved in wanted to landscape it. So what they did is they put down, it feels like miles and miles of that thick black plastic or that, what do we call it, that fabric?
Landscape fabric.
Landscape fabric. Oh, man. Years later, when we have tried to pull it up, we've pulled up a lot of it, but it is a struggle. And interesting thing that we found, we had a couple pink dogwood trees in our front yard that were looking very poor. And I knew that dogwoods had various diseases, and so I thought, oh, well, I guess our trees have those diseases. Well, we pulled up that black plastic, and the black plastic had inches of this thick black composted soil. And underneath it was gray and nothing there. Probably very few soil critters as well. So we pulled up that plastic and those trees are looking great. So please don't use, besides the fact that it's a petroleum product and it's not recyclable, reusable, it lasts a long time. And the other thing that we found out is that the black plastics here, the roots grow over it. And so that's one of the reasons it's such a bear to pull up. And so I can kind of see why they wanted to do that because it was such a wild area and they wanted to plant, but that's again, an example of wanting to control Mother Nature. And short term, it works faster, but it's not what I want. And those
Yeah, I think it should have.
plastic covers, also reduce the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen between the soil and the atmosphere, so, it's just not. If you use one of those, barriers, when you're planting a new tree, a lot of times it will cause the tree to circle around and not be very strong as a result. Another thing to avoid is using cypress mulch. Cypress mulch works fine, not a problem with the mulch. Where the problem is the harvesting of the cypress. Because cypress tend to grow in wet areas, and those wet areas tend to be positive flood zones, so the flooding can go there and it doesn't hurt the cypress, they like wet. And it also prevents some of the storm surges that can happen. I don't recommend using rubber mulch. It has its purposes, but when it's around plants, it doesn't add any organic matter. It often, in the tire making process, there's chemicals and toxins used, not good for the soil. So those leach into the soil. Pebbles and rocks, they're permeable or semi-permeable anyway. They're not terrible as mulches, but the problem with those is that the rocks heat up faster than the ground does. And so then that sends the That makes the soils warmer. The other problem with it is that once you have pebbles or rocks down, it's really hard to get those weeds that grow up, and they eventually will grow up in there. And it's hard to get them up, so then people often want to use some sort of chemical to kill the weeds, and which is coming where I don't want them either, but, you won't even have that issue to deal with if you don't use the rocks. Avoid using peat moss. Peat, you can pick almost any kind of soil conditioner in the stores and the seed starting mixes, and they're heavy peat. Well, peat works well. But harvesting the peat, okay, some other thing, we'll talk about that in a minute. The peat bogs, where the peat comes from, harvests 1/3 of the sequesters, 1/3 of the world's carbon. So that's a lot. And when you harvest the peat, it lets a lot of that carbon into the atmosphere. The peat bogs serve often as a flood reservoir. So again, the peat bogs are wet. They like wet. And so a little more water, that's good. But, so they're actually useful in that way. And they also purify the water. There is a whole flora and fauna ecosystem that lives in the peat bogs that make it home and multiply there and so on. And peat takes hundreds to thousands of years to regrow. So I know there's some effort these days to try to regenerate peat bogs. It takes a very long. We can't keep up with the way we've been using peat in the last number of years. What is particularly, what they've done a lot of work on is using coconut coir instead of peat in seed starting mixes and soil conditioners. And the coir is something that's sustainable because it's the shells of coconuts. And so trees keep growing coconuts. We keep using coconuts, so they break the shells. They grind it up finely. It has about the same pH as peat. It has the same water holding capacities as peat. So it's a good substitution for peat. I've used a lot of soil starter mix that does include peat in the past, but I'm thinking I'm gonna make my own seed starter mix this year and use the coir. One of the things that I can remember being told is that when you buy a plant, you want to plant it, you dig a hole that's way bigger, not any deeper, but way bigger. You put some compost and stuff in there, and then you plant. That isn't the way they're recommending at this point. Because you want the plants you're planting to live in that soil, to live in the native soil. And if you put compost there, sometimes what happens is the plants go to the edge of the compost and don't want to go any further because it's tasty in here. Why would we want to grow? And then you've got plants that aren't as adaptable when it's dry or hot. So using native soil, now I will have to put a caveat on that, and that is if you live somewhere where where it's a relatively new build and you've had the soil scraped away, you don't have native soil anymore. So you'll have to amend that soil. But if you have native soil, please plant right in it. Okay, when plants have experienced drought or flooding, it's important not to fertilize them, water them, overwater them, or prune them, because those all make them more susceptible, particularly to pests. You may think that Well, anyway, so, those are times to be really careful about doing any of those things. They already talked about avoiding tilling or plowing. Last thing that I'm gonna talk about is, I know that at picnics and at various outdoor activities, yellow jackets can be a real pain. They get in pop cans or juice cans or, they come to your picnic and want to eat your meat and your sweet things and all that kind of thing. However, yellow jackets are a wasp, and wasps are very beneficial overall to the environment because while they eat nectar and things as adults, the larvae, when they hatch, need protein. And so the adult yellow jackets generally don't overwinter. So the female lays the eggs and leaves that protein source for them when they hatch. And so they consume a lot of pests that we don't like, mosquitoes and various things, aphids. So, and they also don't have a very long active life. So you'll see them late summer, but in a couple weeks or a few weeks, they're gone. So if you can stand them, I mean, I know you can't have a yellow jacket nest, they nest in the ground. I know you can't have a yellow jacket nest in a playground or something like that. But if you can stand them, it's much better to leave them and let them propagate than to call it your raid and spray them. Okay, so I put the books that I have on here out on the table. I also listened to a Zoom presentation about sustainable gardening in a changing climate. So as you go, okay, as you go out,
These will be back out on the table as people leave,
Okay.
Mary.
and as you go out, get a handout. It's got both the references and those things that I mentioned about the things that can be done. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi, you talked a lot about the heat and causes with that. How about the cold and drought? I mean, we've had very little water too, and I've been wondering, should we be doing any watering or, when they're freezing and now we've got really, really cold. Any suggestions?
One of the things that's helpful when it's gonna be really cold is the water. Which shows some weird water. The water actually insulates the soil, keep it warm. When we think of climate change, probably even refer to this when I was talking. We think of climate change as heat, but it is change. It is heater, colder, changing back and forth, wetter, drier. So being conscious of planting, well, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that became very obvious to me as I was doing this is that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what might come up from former 8A zones into ours, which is what our zone currently is. There's a lot of things we don't know. These are the things we know that can be effective. They may feel like very tiny things, as I said before, but when it all adds up, it all helps. And it really, diversity and adaptation are the key words we need to keep focusing on. That's as best I can do that. Okay. Any other questions?
I have one. Mary, okay, I left my pollinator garden is now looking a mess because I didn't deadhead or take anything out. I've left the leaves in all my beds. And so hopefully I'm providing good wildlife habitat. Now, when should I clean those beds up in the spring? And I assume it's going to be, you're going to say later than I would think.
I think it depends a lot on the weather and how quickly it warms up and things. But generally, March, end of February, March, things are starting to warm up. Then insects are starting to emerge. When you start to see honeybees come out when it's about 50, when you start to see things flying in the air, then you can clean it up because they've emerged.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make a comment about coir, about the coconut fiber. I've been doing that, I think, 3 or 4 years for seed starting. And I find it wets much better than peat.
Oh.
It's really much preferable, and it's not acid. It's neutral. And so I don't have to add any pH change or anything to it. It's just, I mix it with perlite and vermiculite and a little compost, and away we go. It's the basis of all my soil that I make.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, also, one of the other things about peat is it has very little nutrients in it, and the same thing is true for coir. So I think it's going to be a growing thing as we realize more and more what we're doing to our peat bogs.
So what do you do? Do you tear it up?
What?
The core, I have only seen it in sheets.
Oh, it comes in blocks.
Ah,
You
okay.
reconstitute it.
Oh, okay.
I buy a block that's about 2.2 pounds, I think a kilo, and reconstitute it with 5 gallons of water. And then it just gets so nice. And, it doesn't stay hard. You can work with it very nicely.
And I have one more question. When you were talking about the frogs in your swimming pool,
Yes.
I had tadpoles in one of my big pots where I had some water plants, but they never grew. They never grew beyond tadpoles. I mean, months and months. It started getting really cold. Now they froze, which was really sad. I'm sorry. It was really sad. But I mean, I tried to make a way for them. But why was that? I even started feeding them cabbage and the cucumbers. I was feeling sorry for them because it was such a little area, but it still had a plant. So what do yours eat? And they frozen now?
The amphibians tend to go underground in the cold, so I haven't seen any lately. But I don't put anything in there to feed them because as I put the soils in there or the leaves fall in there and decompose, and that the mosquito larvae that gets laid in there, they eat those. So I don't ever even think about feeding them.
Just read an article about what happens with
Jenny?
different, I just read an article about what happens with different animals in the wintertime. And tree frogs actually do freeze and they do not die. Yeah. So, and this same article talked about leaving the leaves a week of 50-degree weather, and then you can, yeah. And then they said you could.
If we get 50 degrees for a week long.
That's a while. Mary, thank you. I always learn so much from Mary. But I have to tell you, Mary is just so, she's so wonderful for our program. I know I said this the last time we were there, that we were here, but Mary is so willing to share her knowledge and also so willing to research for us. She came to me a year ago and said, Ginny, I'm thinking about climate change and gardening for it. What do you think about a Dig Deeper program on this? I'll research it, I'll do it. And, you know, she's just wonderful for this. She heads our Master Gardener student program every 2 years. She's somebody that I have been going to since I've started several years ago, and she's just a wealth of information and willing to share. So it's been wonderful to
And willing
have
to
her.
continue learning
Exactly. Most
and trying
important.
things. Well, I hope that you have something you can take home and use. I hope that I haven't bored you too much with all the details, and happy planting.
Thank you.
Please fill out your feedback forms and we'll take them as you exit.